I was 15 when I had my first girlfriend. We lived in a quiet, peaceful, upper-class neighborhood with calm streets. My girlfriend, Casey, lived just 2 blocks away, so I could walk to her house nearly every night. One Thursday night, during a break when I had nothing planned, I decided to walk over to Casey's place. It was a bit late, but I didn't have a curfew, so it didn't matter. However, as I walked, I started to hear noises around me. And when I say around me, I mostly mean behind me. The first noise I heard was a bush rustling. I quickly glanced behind me without stopping, but saw nothing, so I just picked up the pace a little. As I reached the next block, I heard another sound, a small twig snapping. This time I stopped, turned around, and looked. The street was empty, and the bushes lining the sidewalk were still. Nothing was there, no one in sight. So I started walking faster, trying to shake the feeling of unease. When I was getting close to Casey's house, I heard it again. This time, light footsteps, quick and near. I turned around again but saw nothing. Now, I could see Casey's house up ahead, so I pulled out my phone and called her. She answered right away. I told her how freaked out I was because of the strange noises. As I walked around the bushes surrounding her driveway, stepping onto her property, I noticed her standing at her bedroom window, looking down at me. She waved, and I waved back. Then, she asked, "Who's that guy right behind you?" I whipped around in shock, and there, just behind me, was a fully grown man crouched low, walking slowly and silently, maybe 10 feet behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I screamed as I bolted toward the front door. The man reached for me, trying to grab me in some sort of headlock, but he let go and ran off quickly. I pounded on the door, and Casey's mom opened it with a worried expression. She let me in and slammed the door shut, just as Casey ran over to me. I was gasping for breath, my heart racing. Casey's mom pulled me into a hug and asked what happened before she called the police to report the dangerous man on the loose. She insisted I stay over that night for safety, and the next morning, she drove me home. It was a stormy night, the kind that made everyone stay indoors. My family was scattered around the house doing their own things. I was in my room watching TV. My parents were in the living room enjoying a comedy show, and my sister was upstairs, immersed in a video game. I usually found stormy nights like this comforting. The sound of rain always helped me relax. That was until a loud bang echoed from my window. I jumped to my feet and rushed to the window. Through the heavy rain, I could barely make out a figure standing outside. His face was obscured by the downpour, but his frantic pounding on the window made it clear something was wrong. I heard muffled screams like he was calling for help. I cracked the window open just a bit and he screamed again, "I'm hurt, help me!" His voice was barely audible over the deafening rain. I yelled back, telling him to come around to the front of the house. As I shut the window, I ran to the living room, out of breath, to tell my dad about the man outside. Before I could finish speaking, we heard loud knocks and more frantic shouts coming from our front door. My dad stood up, heading toward the door, but I stopped him. I wasn't sure it was safe. Just as the tension was building, the phone rang. The caller ID displayed our next-door neighbor's name. My dad grabbed the phone, and as soon as I heard him say, "No way," I knew something was wrong. He hung up the phone and said, "Stay away from the door." Without offering any further explanation, he rushed to the window, peeking outside at the front stoop. From where he stood, my dad saw a man crouched by the door, pounding on it, holding a large, sharp tool in his hands. My dad shouted through the door, ordering the man to leave before the cops arrived. Then he quickly dialed 911. After a tense moment, the man seemed to give up and vanished into the night. When we checked again, my dad was on the phone with the neighbor who told him that he had seen a homeless-looking man rummaging through his shed, emerging with a large chopping axe. The police eventually found the man wandering the streets, and the incident made the news a few days later. When I was very young, I was in the living room watching my favorite cartoon. I had the TV turned up pretty loud, but I could have sworn I heard my mom calling my name from downstairs. I called back, "What?" But she didn't respond, so I assumed she couldn't hear me. A few moments later, I heard her voice again, so I decided to head down to the basement. The lights were off, and halfway down the stairs, I called for my mom again, but there was no answer. I had no idea where she could be, But I knew one thing for sure, she wasn't in the basement. I started to go back up the stairs, but just before I reached the top, I heard my mom's voice again, this time from the basement, calling my name. I stood frozen, staring down into the pitch-black darkness. My heart raced as I quickly ran up the stairs, crying out for my mom. She came, rushing down from upstairs, concerned. I told her that something or someone was calling me from the basement, and it sounded just like her. She assured me it wasn't her, and went downstairs to check, trying to calm me down. But I didn't feel any better. I'm sure she didn't. Believe me, I was just a little kid after all. But to this day, I still know exactly what I heard. My grandpa recently shared a story with me about a time he went for a walk with his dog. He used to have a small Boston Terrier named Sherry, who he named after an old friend of his who had passed away. My grandpa lives on a farm about 2 hours away from us in a quiet area where not much happens. He lives there with his wife Mary Ann, whom he married 15 years ago. Every morning, Mary Ann would take Sherry for a walk, and in the evenings, my grandpa would do the same. One evening, as the sun was setting, my grandpa was walking Sherry down their usual dirt path that ran alongside the woods on their property. As they walked, they passed another person on the trail. Sherry, like most dogs, instinctively barked and pulled toward the stranger. My grandpa greeted the person, who had a large hood pulled over his head, but the stranger didn't respond and just walked past them without a glance. My grandpa and Sherry continued walking, but Sherry kept looking back and barking, which caused my grandpa to gently shush her and tug her along. After a few minutes, my grandpa turned around to see what Sherry was barking at. To his surprise, the stranger from earlier was now hiding behind a tree in the distance, watching him. Feeling uneasy, my grandpa decided to pick up the pace. At his age, he always carried pepper spray in his coat pocket just in case. He was getting closer to the house when suddenly, he heard the sound of leaves crunching behind him, much closer than before. Before he could react, he felt a gloved hand cover his mouth and nose, preventing him from breathing or screaming. My grandpa said he could hear Sherry barking and biting at the stranger, which might have helped loosen the man's grip just enough. Struggling, my grandpa managed to grab the pepper spray from his pocket and sprayed it at least 10 times, continuing to spray even as the man let go and began to scream. My grandpa, now desperate, ran as fast as he could back to the house where he was safe. He was shaken but unharmed. I grew up in California for the first 14 years of my life. Our neighborhood wasn't the best, mostly because it was known to be a territory where the Crips, one of Los Angeles' largest street gangs, resided. My best friend, Stevie D, lived 2 doors down. While we had other friends, it was often just the 2 of us hanging out. We'd ride our bikes around the neighborhood or play video games, just the usual kid stuff. One night when we were 12, we decided to bike around the neighborhood and visit a well-known abandoned house. It had been empty for years because no one wanted to buy it for some reason. When we arrived in front of the house, Stevie pointed toward a window and said, "Look." I moved my bike closer to get a better look, and that's when I saw it, a face peeking out from between the curtains. I couldn't tell if the person was looking at us or not, but it was definitely a face, sitting right there in the window. This was especially strange because the house had been uninhabited for so long. We stared for what might have been too long, and then we noticed something else odd. The face didn't move at all. Feeling uneasy, we inched closer to the driveway. The closer we got, the more it became clear that the face wasn't a person at all, but a Halloween decoration or some sort of fake head. Someone had snuck into the house to put it there. Being the mischievous kids we were, Stevie and I decided to sneak in through the back and explore the house. We hid our bikes behind an overgrown bush, then slipped into the yard. To our surprise, the back door was already unlocked. It wasn't that surprising, though, considering someone had already broken in to place the fake head. We cautiously stepped inside, trying not to turn on any lights to avoid alerting anyone that we were there. It was dark, but not completely black, so we managed to make our way through the house. We went straight to the living room to check out the fake head from the window, but when I picked it up from the windowsill, the room suddenly smelled overwhelmingly bad. As I held the head, I immediately dropped it, screaming. It wasn't heavy like a decoration, but instead it felt like real skin. Dark liquid poured out from the bottom of the head, spilling onto the floor. It was blood, a real human head. Stevie and I stood frozen, staring at each other, our mouths agape. We ran for the back door and got back on our bikes, pedaling away, as fast as we could. Word spread quickly that the head belonged to a victim of the Crips, who had apparently placed it there as some sort of warning or message. We didn't know all the details, but there was a good chance that whoever had placed that head was still inside the house. Both Stevie and I heard cracks in the ceiling above us as if someone was coming downstairs. Last year, a man came to my house around 9 p.m. He knocked on the door, so I called my mom and she went out to see who it was. We live in a rural area, so visits like this are pretty rare and always feel strange. The man spoke to my mom about how he was starting a business and asked if she was interested in American-made products. Then he handed her a Clorox container as a sample. After that, he walked back to his minivan and opened it to get what he claimed was a vacuum cleaner. When my mom saw that there were 5 other men sitting inside the van, she immediately told me to run and grab my phone, since we don't have a landline. I couldn't find my phone, so I grabbed a knife instead and stood behind a corner. My mom, realizing something was wrong, threw the container outside and yelled at them to leave, saying she was calling the cops. The men quickly sped off, peeling out of the driveway, and we never saw that van again. I've always been an adrenaline junkie, enjoying extreme sports ever since I was little: mountain climbing, parasailing, scuba diving. But skiing has always been my passion. I made sure to go upstate at least 10 times each ski season, sometimes with friends and sometimes solo. One weekend, my friend Hugh agreed to join me for a camping trip so we could do some backcountry skiing. For those who don't know, backcountry skiing means venturing into unmarked or unpatrolled areas outside the ski resort's boundaries. It was a 3-hour drive followed by some serious off-roading to reach the hills. I parked my truck at the bottom of a nice-looking area full of hills. The reason I stopped there was that it was as far as I could go with all the trees blocking the way. Hugh and I unloaded our gear, including ski equipment and camping supplies, and then hiked about a quarter of a mile to find a good spot for our campsite. It was hard work carrying all our stuff, but we found the perfect spot near the base of an uphill section in a small clearing between the trees. After setting up the tent and unloading the sleeping bags and camping gear, we started our hike up the hill to scout the area. We did plenty of hiking, but also got in some skiing. At one point, while skiing down a bigger hill, I lost track of Hugh. I figured I'd catch up with him at the bottom, or he'd find me eventually. I checked my walkie-talkie to see if he'd answered, but there was no response, which probably meant he was still going downhill. As I walked along the bottom of the hill carrying my skis, I ran into another skier. He seemed friendly, even though his face was hidden by a ski mask. He asked me where the best hills were and if we were camping nearby. His skis were strapped to an orange backpack. I pointed him in the direction of the hill I had just skied down and also pointed toward our campsite. He told me he and his wife were looking for a good place to camp near others and asked if I could show them the way. Although I didn't want to hike all the way back to the campsite, I felt like I should help. So I pulled out my walkie-talkie again to let Hugh know I'd be back at the campsite shortly. I started leading the man behind me, but then I began hearing static over the walkie-talkie, which meant Hugh was probably trying to talk to me. But the connection was lost. I couldn't do anything about it, so I kept walking toward the campsite. After a lot of small talk with the man, we finally arrived. When I turned around to speak to him, I smiled, but then I realized something felt off. I asked him, "Where's your wife?" He didn't answer. The man began to walk closer, and something about his skis and backpack struck me as eerily familiar. For a split second, I thought it might be Hugh playing a prank on me, but then I realized the voice didn't match his. The man was now only a few feet away and quickly closing the distance, walking in a way that felt more aggressive. Panic set in, and I rushed to the tent to grab my flare gun, which was buried in my bag. As I leaned down to dig for it, the man grabbed my leg. I felt a sharp, intense tingle, like an electric shock, followed by searing pain as if my leg were on fire. I screamed in agony, but I managed to pull out the flare gun, pushing aside the tent door. I aimed it at him and he immediately backed off, raising his hands in the air. That's when I saw the knife buried deep in my leg. I demanded that he tell me where Hugh was, and he quickly replied, "Near the bottom of the hill, where he found me." I ordered him to stay where he was as I called 911 for an immediate rescue, but before I could finish, the man ran off, disappearing into the night. I was left alone, bleeding from my leg, with nothing but the flare gun and the walkie-talkie. I felt like I was waiting forever in the cold until finally, I heard the sound of a rescue helicopter approaching. I shot the flare into the air, and I couldn't believe it when the helicopter swooped down to pick me up. The crew helped locate Hugh, who was unconscious lying in the snow near the base of the hill. He'd been stabbed twice in the leg and robbed. Hugh had tried to reach me through the walkie-talkie while losing consciousness, but the connection was too weak. We both made it to the hospital, and despite the traumatic experience, we're both fine today. I lived in a small college town, and my apartment complex was just a short walk from the downtown area and the bar. One weekday night, I stepped out onto our front porch to smoke a cigarette or two. I had been up late studying, so I brought my textbook with me and sat on the stairs as I smoked. A girl who lived in the apartment next to mine, on the ground floor, came home from downtown. She was alone, and it was obvious she had been drinking based on her unsteady walk. She got to her apartment, barely getting the door shut when a man suddenly knocked on it. She opened the door and I noticed the guy introduced himself, which struck me as odd. It was around 2:30 a.m. Who just shows up at someone's apartment at that hour? Curious, I decided to stay outside and watch. The two of them talked for over 10 minutes. The girl later admitted how strange it was, but said she didn't know how to end the conversation. The guy would do things that creeped me out, like reaching up and stroking her hair at least 3 times. He also kept trying to inch his way closer to her as she stood in the doorway. To make sure he knew I was there, I purposely made noise with my textbook. After a while, he left, disappearing as strangely as he had appeared. I immediately called the cops. A few days later, they had the girl and me sit with a sketch artist. Once the sketch was released to the public, there was an influx of calls. It turned out the guy was a serial rapist who followed women home from bars, pretending to be a cab offering them a ride. The girl was lucky because she lived so close to the bars that he didn't get a chance to use his usual routine. I've only ever used Craigslist once in my life, and that one experience left me with a very bad taste in my mouth. Here's why. A guy posted an ad for a ping pong table that I wanted to buy for me and my roommate. We set up a time for me to pick it up that evening. To fit the table in my truck, I had to remove the back seats. I pulled up in front of his house, texted him saying I had arrived, and saw the door open. I got out of my truck and speed walked to the front door to greet him. I went for a handshake, but I don't think he noticed, so after a few awkward moments, I let my hand drop. His voice, rough and deep from smoking, asked me to follow him to the basement. The whole house had this distinct smell, not bad but kind, of like cotton mixed with smoke. We made our way downstairs, and there was the ping pong table sitting right in the middle of the room. Suddenly he said, "Oh shoot, I need to find the paddles," and ran back up the stairs, telling me to wait. I stood there for a while, assuming he just misplaced the paddles, and started snooping around the basement. It felt strange. He had framed pictures scattered across the furniture, but they were all pictures of just him, no family members. There was one where he was with a dog, but that was about it. 10 minutes passed and I was still standing there. I decided to check out the back laundry storage room. I noticed a drawer hanging halfway open on his utility desk. I pulled it fully open and found a stack of old Polaroid photos. But these weren't just any photos. They were disturbing and horrific. They showed a girl tied to a chair with her mouth taped shut. Beside the photos, there were yellow folders, stacked neatly and labeled from A to Z. I couldn't bring myself to open the folders and see what was inside, but I took out my phone to take pictures of the contents. I planned to send them to my friends right away, but I couldn't get any service down there. That's when I knew it was time to leave. I ran to the door at the top of the stairs, but when I tried the doorknob, I found it was locked. As soon as I touched the handle, I heard the man's deep, raspy voice on the other side of the door. He apologized, saying the door had accidentally locked and that he'd go find the key. I didn't respond. I examined the keyhole closely and then ran back down the stairs. I grabbed 3 screwdrivers from his desk and tried each one in the keyhole. The smallest one fit, and I managed to turn it just enough to unlock the door. I didn't stop to look around. I just ran out of the door, straight to my car. I didn't look back at the house. I just drove straight to the nearest police station. I showed them the photos, gave them the address, and told them where to find the rest of the photos. That was enough for them to begin their investigation. A few days later, I learned that the man was part of a child pornography ring operating on the deep web. Apparently, that's how he made a living. Why he locked me in his basement, I'll never know. I have no idea what he intended to do with me, but I'm certain it wasn't anything good. When I was 14, I used to babysit, and one day I was asked to look after a 6-year-old boy named Cody. His parents gave me a few basic instructions, like ordering pizza for dinner and making sure he didn't go into their room. But then they mentioned something odd. They told me that Cody wasn't like other kids. Apparently, he had a tendency to talk to himself or his imaginary friend Agnes, especially when he was playing with his toys. It was a rainy afternoon, and I was sitting on the couch, watching reruns of the old Wipeout show from the early 2000s. Cody was on the floor in front of me, playing with his toys that were scattered across the living room. He kept saying the name Agnes as he pretended to play with someone sitting across from him. Then, something strange happened. One of his toys, a little cube-shaped one with a crank, suddenly activated on its own. The toy was one of those old ones where you pull the crank, and it shows a moving, racing background on the screen. It's the kind of toy that would require a bit of effort to make work, so I found it odd that it started up by itself. I asked Cody how that happened, and he simply replied, "Agnes is playing with it." I have to admit, it was unnerving to hear him say that. I picked up the toy and turned it off. Later that night, as I was waiting for Cody's parents to return, I was washing up in the bathroom when I heard a knock on the door. I called out for Cody, but when I opened the door, he wasn't there. I glanced down the hallway, and that's when I noticed something unsettling. One of the doors at the end of the hall started to creak open. And I mean, it was opening very slowly. I turned off the bathroom lights and walked into the room, expecting to find Cody, maybe trying to play a prank. Instead, I found him sitting on the bed in the far corner of the room, just staring at me. I asked him, "Who opened the door, Cody?" Without missing a beat, he replied, "Agnes." At this point, I was officially freaked out. I quickly walked over to Cody, picked him up, and took him to the living room where I stayed with him for the rest of the night, waiting for his parents to come home. When they did return, I didn't mention any of the strange things that had happened. But a few weeks later, when they called me to babysit again, I never called them back. That was another true story, but in the world of horror, truth is often stranger than fiction. If you're still watching, you're one of the brave ones. Most don't make it this far. Before you go, check behind you. Not everything that follows you makes a sound. Subscribe to Horror Stories and hit the bell because the next horror stories drop soon. And remember, the scariest stories are the ones that actually happened. Stay scared. Stay safe. We'll see you in the dark.